appreciate it. So thank you all for having me here. Thank you all for turning out. Everybody can hear me all right? I do kind of roam around a little bit, and I'll probably get my head in front of that. Just throw a shoe at me or something like that, and I'll try to get back on track. So as Rich said, I'm going to talk about two events that kind of bracket make sure I know what I'm clicking here to get this. Nope, went the wrong way. How did I get off of one show? And sorry about that. I'm a laptop moron, so if anyone can screw this up, it'll be me. There we go. All right. So these two. I'm going to be very careful where I put my hands from here on. So does that slide up to there? Not showing up here though. There you go. I guess that's the button you use now. It doesn't go there, but that's, don't worry about it. That's good. So the two events we're going to talk about bracket this book. As Rich said, there's a couple there in it that try to be happy if some of you are intrigued enough to want to buy them today. To me, the pivotal year for Stuart's cavalry and arguably for Lee's Army of Northern Virginia is the year from June of 1862 to July 1863. And you can kind of make a link between that success and Jeb Stuart's career. So is this kind of rather amateurish slide there? Hopefully it conveys. In June of 1862, Stuart begins that terrific year for the South with his Peninsula raid, brings the information to Robert E. Lee, who just taken command of the Army of Northern Virginia, allows him to force George McClellan away from the gates of Richmond. Stuart does so to great acclaim in the South. He becomes a darling of the South at that point. He was already fairly well known, but that's going to catapult him well above that. In August, he has the raid on John Pope's supply depot at Catlett Station and ride around McClellan. And then at the midpoint of that year is the Christmas raid. That's where we're going to start here in a second. And then it's going to end up on the cusp of the Gettysburg campaign, or actually on the cusp of the actual Battle of Gettysburg. When Stuart, as I'm sure most of you know, will fall into a great deal of controversy. Key to this story tonight is Washington, D.C. As the capital of the North, you may or may not really have given thought to the fact that Washington, throughout the war, is, in the sentiment of its populace, a southern city. It's not a northern city. They're not necessarily all for the North. It's a southern city surrounded by the border state of Maryland and the state of Virginia, the southern state there. And it's also surrounded by high ground. So one of the first things that they did, the North had to do, was fortify the city to try to protect it. And although this map is partly cut off for our purposes tonight, hopefully it gives you, you'll see it a couple of times, it gives you a sense of those fortifications as they ring the city with those circles there. We will come back to that, I said a couple of times. So Starting with the Christmas parade, we'll go through it pretty quickly because I want to spend more time on something most of you've never heard of. By December 23rd, Lee calls Stuart to his headquarters. He wants to hit the Federal Army one more time before the winter, the heaviest part of winter, shuts down the roads, turns them to mud, shuts down the ability to bring supplies in, which would cripple their horses. And he will, in fact, in January after this, disperse his cavalry for the most part, quite a ways away from the Army of Northern Virginia, so that they can rest their horses and recover them for the spring and summer campaigns. So before he does that, he wants to make one more shot at the federal supply line. So his orders to Stuart are very simple. The key part of it is those two sentences right there. To ascertain where they are and to try and inflict as much damage on them as he can in a short period of time. He selects, because it doesn't move here, he selects 1,800 men from his command. He's got a cavalry division of 3 brigades. He's not picking entire regiments. He's picking the men based on the ability of their horses, the perceived ability of their horses, to get them wherever they're going to go and to get them back. So he's not picking the best soldiers necessarily. He's picking the best horses as the criteria on who's going to go on this raid. And then he takes, and it's indeterminate, 4 or 6 guns from 2 different batteries. So he starts on Christmas Day, gathers a command at Brandy Station in Culpeper County, comes across Fauquier County, and he will gather the command again at the edge of Prince William County, in an area known during the war as Cole's Store. And you'll see it up on the left-hand side of that map. That name has pretty much disappeared. But Independent Hill, I'm sure, is familiar with many of you. It's 234, goes right through that area today, south of Manassas. Bring them there, and then he's going to disperse them into 3 columns to try to break up Ambrose Burnside, the Army of the Potomac supply line. The first target is the town of Occoquan. It's just across the Occoquan River, which is very different today. Any of you that used to travel up and down 95 and you're part of your commute, but there were no bridges there at the time. There was a rope ferry at Occoquan. There were multiple fords. I'll show you some photographs of a couple of them here in a minute. But everything else is different, and the river was not the reservoir we know of today. So he's going to hit Occoquan 20 miles south of Washington. I want to go back one slide, though. I don't screw this up. Somehow something eluded, but we'll just not worry about it. His second target is the town of Dumfries. There's a supply depot there. There's a Union garrison there, cavalry and infantry. He's going to send 2. And then he's going to go after not really the supply depot at Aquia, which is massive. That's a photograph of an area that you can actually drive where those railroad tracks are today. Some of you may have done it. And there's a park there today. He wants to cut the line above Aquia, so between Aquia and Dumfries, and then at Occoquan. Defending Washington at the time, besides those fortifications, there was a mobile force of cavalry and infantry that moved east and west from Washington out towards the Fairfax-Loudoun County border, the Fairfax-Prince William border, as Union successes ebbed and did well and did poorly. So after Second Manassas, they were all back towards Washington. By Christmas, they've all branched out. And so that mobile force is just on the western edge, or the eastern edge, of the Fairfax, Prince William, or Loudoun County border. So that's how close those troops are. And part of what is important to keep in mind, as I hope we will bring all together at the end, is the notion that Stuart is not going to ride around again. He's going to ride through the enemy. And that makes it, I believe, possible for the second part of this talk to be important. There was no railroad at the time between Fredericksburg or Aquia and Washington. So all the supplies coming from Washington, the large depot at Alexandria, had to come by road. They came down Route 1, which was known as the Telegraph Road at the time, more commonly today either Route 1 or now Emancipation Highway. And that area had been hit 3 times between November and December, 3 times by Wade Hampton's cavalry, and with some success. So Stuart assumed that if I take a larger force of cavalry than Wade Hampton had, I will have greater success. What he did not realize was that because of the earlier success, the Federals still had an alternative. And they just shipped all their supplies by water. So there's really nothing that he's going to be able to do here to the scale he is hoping to accomplish. The only wagons moving on Route 1 are private sutlers' wagons. I'm sure most of you know there were those kind of entrepreneurs who had a contract with a Union command to provide supplies to the men that were not provided by the Army for sale. Those are the wagons that are still, they're not coming by military chartered ships. They're still coming down Route 1, and that's where he's going to have success. So he was going to send Wade Hampton after the town of Occoquan, Rooney Lee after the town of Dumfries, and Fitzlee to cut the road, cut Route 1 below Dumfries, and then converge upon the town. And the battle there is going to go very quickly. Now, Stuart is, in my mind, will see this raid as a failure, and others will as well. He will not write about this for 14 months. And if there's anything to me that kind of tells me that's when he sees it, I believe that's it right there. So we don't get any great descriptions about when he does certain things. So this comes from northern newspapers. They're there for about 6 hours. They will shell the town with the artillery that they have from the heights around the town, and they will make one half-hearted attempt to get across and attack the infantry. The cavalry, especially at this point in the war, is not designed to attack infantry. Moreover, if any of you ever worked down there at the Marine Corps base, commuted up and down that way, you know, I take the train between where we live down there in King George County and in DC routinely, and in the wintertime, you just look out and it's all swamp. It's just always wet. It's always mucky, cut by all these streams, and it was the same then. So across these frozen streams, break through the ice, get the horses, and they have no success. They're going to get shot up, and Stuart realizes this isn't going to work, and he will pull back. Hampton will try to do the same, make a coordinated attack against Occoquan. No cell phones at the time. It's a really hard thing to do to try to coordinate 2 different columns. One goes before the other. They will come up empty as well, because remember, there's only the rope ferry there. They're going to bring 1 or 2 wagons across at a time, and once they realize the enemy's there, they just quit bringing the wagons across the road. So they will have some minor success. They'll capture a bunch of cavalrymen around Dumfries, and they will capture some sutlers' wagons. But it is not the success that he was hoping for. So what he's going to do is order all of the men back to the area of Independent Hill Coal Store that night. And he's going to decide that he's going to cancel the raid. They're all going to go home. He's going to send the prisoners ahead first, and he does that. He sends his artillery ahead next because they've shot up all their ammunition. So whatever happens, they're not going to do them any good. They're an impediment, so he sends them back. He sends a guard force with them. And then a person who we know nothing about. We don't know it's a man or a woman. Don't know anything about them. But we comes from multiple sources, including members of Stuart's staff. So there's no reason to disbelieve this. Comes into the camp, has a meeting with Stuart, and tells him something that convinces him to continue the raid. And so he will do that. In the meantime, the Federals have begun reacting to the incursion, and they're going to send a division of infantry down to block the ford at Wolf Run Shoals. Now, this is one of the most famous fords in Northern Virginia. That's a picture of it, taken in the winter from the Fairfax side where there's a park. Anybody ever been down there? And you're looking across without the leaves on it, you can see how big that road is right there. That's the Civil War road in the center of the picture. It was a two-track road to get columns in both directions or two columns moving across at a time. That's how important that ford was. Stuart planned to come across there, and they sent an infantry force to block that. They will also send the Federals a cavalry force across from Occoquan into Prince William County to go look for Stuart. They don't know if he's still here or not. He's pulled back. And they're going to send two, there's no other way to be nice about it, two rookie regiments. One of them had probably not been with the Army even. They literally probably did not have ammunition based on later reports in their guns. They go into Prince William County, and somewhere probably around what we know today as Lake Ridge or somewhere in there, they will run into the entire 1,800 men of Stuart's command and get completely routed. They'll be the survivors who are not captured will be sent back across the Occoquan at this ford, which I hope, and that's the best picture you can kind of get from it without a boat. That sign in the middle, I hope you can at least see the sign, identifies that as the point known as Selectman's Ford. It's just one ford up from Wolf Run Shoals and kind of vaguely in the trees there with no leaves on. You can see the old Civil War road going up the embankment. The Federals will chase them across there, skirmish with some other cavalry on the other side. But all this gives the Federal commander time to arrange his defenses. So the man commanding what was known as the defenses of Washington, also known as the 22nd Army Corps or the Department of Washington, is this gentleman, Samuel Heintzelman. He is not going to do what had always been done by the Federals when Stuart went on a raid before. He would send their cavalry after him. They would chase him from behind, never catch them, wear out their horses, embarrass themselves, and go home with nothing to hold on to. Heintzelman doesn't have enough cavalry to even attempt that. So he's going to, in other words, deploy his infantry to protect all of his assets and give Stuart a corridor by which he has no other way to go except through that corridor, and through which he can create no mischief. So Stuart will go to Burke Station on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad that comes out of Washington. Alexandria goes westward. He will stop there, and they know, the Federals know this because he's got a couple of telegraphers with him. The telegraph station or Burke Station, they will begin listening to all the Union telegrams, all the traffic, and they will begin sending their own kind of sarcastic messages back to the Federals, asking them to send better horses, better mules, the ones we've captured have been terrible, that kind of thing. So the Federals know where he is and basically when he is there, and they will try to make one attempt to burn a bridge over Accotink Creek. Now, don't be confused if you don't know the Springfield area. We'll talk about the little town of Accotink later on. They're not related necessarily. This is up in Springfield today. They don't have the ability to do that. They're going to try, but it's a stone and iron bridge. They don't have the material to do it. So whatever they wrote about the great success it had tearing the bridge up is really inaccurate because it was back in service the very next day. So, as I said, Heintzelman is going to deploy his men to create an avenue, which hopefully you can pick out on that map there. He's going to have troops protecting Alexandria. He's going to have a massive force protecting a huge supply depot at Fairfax Station. And he's going to have troops blocking the route into Alexandria along the Wool River Turnpike. He's going to have his small cavalry force going back and forth between it. And then he's just going to wait and let Stuart do what Stuart wants to do. They know that he's left Burke Station by about 10 o'clock because he will run into a cavalry patrol, overwhelm them. The survivors will get back. Everyone else, the infantry, will hear the gunfire, know that Stuart's coming. He will have two skirmishes. one that I just mentioned, another one on the outskirts of Fairfax Courthouse with Edwin Stoughton's Vermont Brigade. And I mention that only because Stoughton was the man who will be captured by John Mosby on March 9th. Stuart will kind of deceive the Federals into thinking he's going into camp there for the night. He's going to have his men build up a bunch of campfires. And then under the cover of those campfires, he's going to lead them out. The most direct route for him to have left on is Route 50 today, going out to Chantilly. The Federals have blocked that, so he goes up along the old Herndon Railroad and heads out. And that is essentially the Christmas raid. As you see here, Wade Hampton termed it a failure at the time. There is a schism developing between Wade Hampton and Jeb Stuart, and this is going to help widen that because of some things that happened on the raid. If time allows and you ask me a question, we can go into that. I don't want to do it now and get in trouble with the boss sitting right over here. Did I go too long? But one of the successes, as I said, is that on the night of the 29th, he stops in Middleburg, Virginia, at Oakham Farm. I'm sure many of you know where that is, right off of Route 50 between Middleburg and Aldie. And that's where he will give John Mosby his authority to begin conducting guerrilla operations. The Federals should have seen this as a success, but what they know is that Stuart got away again. That's all they look at. Stuart got away again. He's done it again. He's embarrassed us again. And in fact, Heinzman had done exactly everything that he should have done. But here's the key. I want you to keep the town of Annandale in mind as we go forward. He's going to get to Annandale. That's where the skirmish is going to be with the cavalry force. And as I will show you soon, Annandale is just a few miles from the fixed fortifications of Washington. So as we go forward, remember I said, he's not going around the army, he's going through the army. So there's Annandale in the big circle. There's the map again with the fortifications on it. This idea, more than the Federals took away from this raid more than the others, that Stuart was not at all afraid to challenge them. Where he'd gone around them before, he was going to challenge them by coming in up against the Union fortifications. And while I'm not trying to say anything to you about this, an idea in their mind already that what they're going to do in the summer, this will make Stuart in the Union mindset one of the great persons they have to fear. I think, as Rich was saying, the South did read the newspapers. Lee read Northern newspapers all the time. Northern generals are always trying to get correspondents kicked out of the army because they've given away all their plans and telling everybody what they were going to do. So the South had an idea how things were being perceived in the North. This is the key to everything I'm going to tell you about the second idea. Don't lock into the fact in your mind, as I see a lot of people go, oh, this could never have happened. This would never have happened. No, it's perception versus reality. It's what the Federals believed Stuart could do, which allowed them to believe Stuart would do it. Everything I'm going to show you almost exclusively is from Federal viewpoint. There is no official documentation from Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, anybody in the South that this was ever planned. All right, I want to be clear on that up front. Doesn't mean it wasn't planned. How it does. We know most of the Southern records were destroyed at the end of the war, either accidentally by the fires or there was a Confederate Secret Service. They did do things like this. There's no question that they tried to spread smallpox in some of the northern cities and things like that. Very well-known story by the Confederate Secret Service. Those records are believed to have been deliberately burned. Keep in mind, Stuart's Christmas raid, he comes into the fortifications of Washington, and now we're going to talk about the raid, as I term it, that never was. So Lee meets with Davis for 3 days in May 1863 in Richmond to discuss the summer campaign. There are no records of that raid. We have no written documentation whatsoever about what was discussed, but we know the general parameters. That Davis wanted Lee to hold his army in camp essentially, send part of the army to help defend Vicksburg, Mississippi. He would tie up the rest of the army, but he was not going to go on what he wanted to do, and that's the invasion of the North. Now, there's a great debate now about whether it's called invasion or a raid. Talk about that later if you want. Lee will prevail, and we all know what's going to happen. He's going to lead his army north into Pennsylvania eventually. The key is this document right here. This is from Samuel Heintzelman's journal. If you want to read what I highlight, you'll have the key part. On May 20th, the man most directly responsible for protecting Washington, Lincoln, and his cabinet is Samuel Heintzelman. And he writes that a spy comes into their office that day, man he believed to be reliable, says he'd seen the evidence of what he was going to tell him, and that the South was going to send men into Washington to capture Lincoln, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and Secretary of State William Seward. Now, again, before you go ahead, this never happened. They're not going to lead 1,500 men down Pennsylvania. Never, I don't think that would ever have been considered. You have to keep in mind, one, there's no security force in Lincoln. He had two companies of cavalry, which were assigned to go with him when he went on a ride, which he did all the time on his own. And he didn't want them around him because he wanted, as you have to imagine the stress he's under. He's got anybody could walk into the White House, walk to the doorkeeper, present a card, say, I'd like a few minutes of the president's time. And eventually the president would try to find time to accommodate. So anybody can walk in. There's no security beyond that. But Lincoln would go out just to get away from all the clamor in the White House, all the things on his mind, just ride the streets out to what they called the summer White House. And we know, I hope, that later in the war, there's a shot taken at him where it knocks his hat off his head. There's an attempt to assassinate him. Remember, John Wilkes Booth, his initial plan was to kidnap Lincoln, not kill him. So this is certainly something that was thought of in other ways. Send a couple of men in and see what they could do. Now, how many people am I going to get in trouble with? How many people here are Mosby fans to the hill? All right. So since this was published, Mosby fans have latched on to this statement, testimony by Joseph Hooker in March of 1865, saying that the North was so afraid of John Mosby that they took up the planks of the bridges into Washington every night. All right. Now, if you look at that statement there, he says, well, the whole time I was in command of the Army of Potomac, there's not but 200 men within 100 miles of Washington. Well, Lee's entire army is within 100 miles of Washington the entire time. All right. Hooker and Heintzelman hate each other. When Hooker got command of the army, prior to that, the Army of the Potomac commander was the boss of the man commanding the defenses of Washington. In other words, they would have been in the chain of command. Heintzelman says, look, if Hooker's going to take command of the army, you either make me a separate entity or I'm moving. So they make him a completely separate entity. He does not have to pass anything by Joseph Hooker. There's really no reason for us to believe that Hooker was aware of what actually was going on in the real details. The only evidence of what Hooker says there, and taking the planks up of the bridges, the two documents that I'm going to show you. And I don't expect you to read the actual document, but I highlighted the part of it. You'll notice the date that I've circled. It's the same day as what Heintzelman wrote in his journal, May 20th. That very day, the very first thing Heintzelman does is say, you're going to take up the planks of the bridges, and we're going, and he highlights the fact that we want to prevent carriages from going across the bridges. Anybody here can prove that I'm wrong, or that there's another order prior to this, I'll be happy to take it all back. This had never been published before. This is by his chief of staff to Joseph Willard, who was the scion of the family that owned Willard's Hotel. And he will leave the Army shortly thereafter and return to the hotel business. telling him to go out and make sure this is done. Why a carriage? If you're going to kidnap somebody who doesn't want to go with you, you're not just going to have him on a horse and hope he's going to follow you either, especially something looks like Lincoln. Even in the dark, Lincoln's going to be pretty recognizable. You can put him in a carriage, you control him, you got a little cover over it. So they focus on preventing carriages from going across. The same day, there's a second order sent out. Same thing from Heintzelman's command, his chief of staff. Now you see them talk about the aqueduct bridge and the chain bridge and the long bridge. And you see the idea now of a cavalry raid. So I'm sure most of you know this. The dark bridge at the top of the map, that's chain bridge. The one in the middle is the long bridge. The one at the bottom is the aqueduct bridge. You get a sense there of how close they are to the White House and how close they are to Annandale, where he had been in December of 1862. I'll go through these pretty quick. As easier, I'm going to turn a little bit so I make sure I don't waste time. And this is just the dissemination of the orders from Heintzelman through Lathrop down to his senior subordinates. You notice the date is still the same. 3 days later, Halleck is the Army Chief of Staff. He's talking to Stanton, of course, one of the targets of the raid, one of the intended victims of it, if you will. Speaking of a raid and reiterating that they're going to take up the flanks of the bridges. How many know who Ulrich Dahlgren is? Some of you recognize the name. Tim, you don't count. Okay. There's a Navy base named after his father. You're absolutely right. All right. So Dahlgren is a staff officer. He's an aide to Joseph Hooker. Now, it's important to know that I said Hooker would not be in the chain of command. It doesn't mean he doesn't know what's going on, all right, to some extent. But he's not seeing those orders, is my point earlier. Dahlgren tells Hooker, look, if this raid is going to happen, if we get any evidence that the South has launched this raid on Washington, we should make our own raid to Richmond. All right? And specifically, talks about burning the bridges over the James River. Does this sound familiar to anybody yet? Now, the papers at the time were just as partisan as they are today. They either hated Lincoln or they loved Lincoln. They either for the war or against the war. Nothing's really changed. You'll see how this has become inflated. I've jumped ahead about a month. Look at the date there. Paper is published June 23rd. It's an item dated June 20th. That they're not only now going to capture or kidnap those men, they're going to burn the city of Washington. How that gets in there, I have no clue. But clearly the story had grown a little bit. In February and March 1864, Ulrich Dahlgren leads a very controversial raid to Richmond with Judson Kilpatrick. And I've put on the key documents there that are found on Dahlgren's body after he's killed. That they were going to kill Jefferson Davis and they were going to burn the city. And this absolutely inflames the South. They cannot believe what they've just found. To them, the North has raised the black flag. They've escalated the whole level of the war. This is really over the top for them. But if you are the North, just because nothing happens and Lincoln is not actually kidnapped doesn't mean they don't believe that the South had tried to do this earlier. All right, you see the connection there? I'm not saying that happens. We don't know. Lincoln never admitted to anything. No one wanted. Dahlgren was dead, so everyone hung this on Dahlgren, and no one else took any responsibility for it. May 24th, Heintzelman again talking about a raid. One of the keys here also, in terms of what will happen with the Cavalry Corps Army of the Potomac, is that all of the horses coming into the army, the new horses, are going to be diverted to Heintzelman's cavalry division. That's led by Julius Stahl, and they're going to be diverted away from the Cavalry Corps Army of the Potomac. The Army of the Potomac's cavalry is trying to rebuild after the Stoneman raid, in which they lost thousands and thousands of horses. Now, all those horses are going to Stahl, and you even see the one comment there, that he's going to get the very best horses available. General Montgomery Meigs was the Army quartermaster. He writes this, as you see there. He actually draws this out. He tells his subordinates to erect barricades in the depot in Alexandria across the streets. He designs the barricades, what they should look like, tells them where to place them to prevent a cavalry raid. May 26th, now, for whatever reason, all we have is Heintzelman's note on this. They've got an idea that the raid is going to focus in the area between Fort Lyon and Fort Ellsworth. So if you go back to the map, the two arrows at the very bottom of the map point to where Fort Lyon and Fort Ellsworth are. Again, there's Little River Turnpike. There's the bridges. The circle is Annandale. On May 27th, they're talking about obstructing all the roads. And this idea has got to the point where even the railroad the engineers, as you see in one's written in his official journal, grand rebel raid expected today. The idea is getting out throughout the area. June 3rd, now the idea in some hands is taking an idea that they're going to come down from Maryland. And one of the avenues that the North always feared was that the South would go down the Shenandoah Valley, cross the Potomac River, and drop into Washington from the north. That's the second thing they're looking at. And now they start to see the collection of cavalry, Stuart's entire division, in Culpeper County, and they assumed, based on everything else, perception versus reality, this must be the gathering for the raid. Bernard is the man who actually, the engineer officer who built the defenses of Washington, the fortifications. He's trying to make sure, because like a lot of things that we do, we have contingency plans. The military is great for them. The police department was great for them. Someone writes it up, they put it on a shelf, and it gathers dust, and no one ever sees it again. Well, they built these fortifications, and then if there was no fear of them being needed, they would just kind of let them go, and they deteriorate. And now they're racing around to try to get them back in shape, to the extent that there's a shortage of black labor. So the labor force is the contrabands that are being held in Alexandria, in the Freeman's camps there. They're actually sending ships down to contraband camps in North Carolina to bring them back up because they need to expand the labor force. And the interesting thing is, if you think about it, will get to the point. The first time that somebody asked them, they said, look, should we just take them, or are we going to give them the option? And he said, it's not that bad yet. If they don't want to go, let them stay. As it gets closer to the happening, they're going to get asked again, and the answer is going to be no, you'll just take them. Whether they want to go or not, you'll put them on a ship with or without their family and bring them to Alexandria because we need them to build these fortifications. So imagine you just escaped slavery. Now you're going to be brought back. You think you've reached freedom. So it's not a small point there. June 8th is the day before the Battle of Brandy Station. George Sharp is Joseph Hooker's chief intelligence officer. He's talking about the raid. You see the mention beneath it, June 9th, Battle of Brandy Station. And Pleasanton talks about capturing some papers during the battle that confirmed that there was going to be a raid. This is the only documentation that we believe is from the South that actually says something about this raid. I don't expect you to be able to read the letter itself, but I put the key part of it over to the side here. This is a letter found in a desk on the battlefield, signed by a man named Bill, so we can't go back and find out who he is, try to track him down. And it says, we're going to make a raid, and it will be something grand. So to them, the Federals, again, they're cementing in their idea, in their mind, that there is going to be something happen. And they want to think that they've put that raid off by the battle. And then there'll be some debate. Well, actually, this letter was published in a newspaper. So the one's in an archive at the Huntington Library, California. This was published in a newspaper. The initials really don't help narrow it down. You have to search through about 12,000 men to try to figure out who this is. I haven't done that. But again, you'll see that it mentions making a grand raid towards the Potomac. So as I said, there's some uncertainty. Pleasanton thinks he's put the raid off. Hooker says, I'm not so certain as you are that it's not going to continue. And so now we're just going to kind of jump ahead. Overlaid on the Christmas raid map, the heavy arrow is the route Stuart will take into Fairfax County on his controversial ride to Gettysburg. You see how close it mirrors what he did in December. One of the many, many questions, and we would be here all night if we got into the controversies of Stuart's ride to Gettysburg. One of the many questions is why, when his horses are exhausted, they've been fighting for a week in the Loudoun Valley, there's no rest for them, he's got to stop every day to rest his horses. Why does he send Fitz-Lee's brigade to Annandale? Moreover, why does he move east of the Shenandoah Valley instead of west? In other words, why does he come out of Rector's Crossroads like this, right through the Union Army, when he could have done that? There would have been no Federals to beat him. He would have got up into Maryland and Pennsylvania much quicker. And I believe because that's where he had been before. He's on the cusp of the defenses of Washington. If you want to convince the Federals, here's what's something I didn't already say. When Stuart goes north in September of 1862 and ends up at the Battle of Antietam, one of the things he was disappointed about was that he did not get farther north before McClellan brought him to battle. We all know McClellan has a reputation of having slows. I think Lee thought he would take advantage of that. He'd get up farther north, and in fact, McClellan moves very quickly, brings him to battle very quickly. So Lee wants something to happen that will prevent the enemy from bringing him to battle too soon. And I think that's why this idea of this raid. Now, I don't know that they ever intended to do this. They just had to make the Federals think they were going to do it. And so at the end, they're reading the newspapers. By sending an entire brigade to Annandale, pushes them towards Washington and will hold Hooker's army around the defenses of Washington longer to allow the rest of Lee's army to get farther north. Now, as I said, I keep shoving more and more stuff in here. I got to take stuff out of the front end. I have tried to track these men down, and the papers notoriously screwed up people's names, because you have to understand the process was generally somebody copied it down, they didn't know how to spell it, they sent it via telegram. The telegrapher had to write it out, then somebody had to, the other end had to decipher it. It becomes impossible to find them. But four men, Civil War or Confederate markings on their horses, are found near Mount Vernon. We all know have a sense where Mount Vernon is, George Washington's home. This is the Alexandria Gazette. This is all June 28th. Now they mentioned the town of Accotink. Remember, I said not to confuse it with the bridge over Accotink Creek. They mentioned the home of Thomas Wright and the entire brigade of Fitz-Lee. So on a Civil War map down at the very bottom, I've circled the town of Accotink. That is where Fort Belvoir was. If anyone doesn't really know where that was, that's been taken up by Fort Belvoir. That's the Wright home right there. That's Mount Vernon. And you start to see the proximity of where that lines up with the other map I've been using already. So just taking one away, there's Annandale. The circle at the bottom is Accotink and Mount Vernon. And that circle is where Fort Lyon and Fort Ellsworth are. And so again, in the Federal mind, when the Confederate cavalry go to Annandale, they're right on the road into Alexandria City, where Fort Ellsworth and Fort Lyon are. There's some certainty in their mind that this is still continuing. This is still going to happen. Now, mind you, Stuart is going to be across the Potomac River by the time this all happens. He's going to capture the wagon train up around Rockville. They're gone. But the Federals don't know this, and they can't take a chance. A lot of people say, well, now, all you have to do is look back at 9/11 and all the hearings about who knew what, when, where, who told what to do. right? Who didn't tell them? The FBI didn't like the CIA, CIA didn't like all that kind of stuff. If they had ignored this, said, no, this nonsense is never going to happen, and Lincoln had been kidnapped, they'd have been held. This is a map drawn by a general who was in Arlington House. His headquarters were in Lee's home, Arlington House, at the time. And it took me a while to figure out how to orient this map. Now, it's pretty clear on there. He identifies Columbia Pike, Little River Turnpike, the Leesburg Pike. But the only thing I didn't know was Paget's Tavern, where Annandale is. And once I had give yourself some eye strain, search a bunch of Civil War maps, find something that said Paget's Tavern, and then you can orient the map so it makes sense. So it's all upside down. And that's why I put everything back in so you can read it. You see how close that is to Fort Ward and Fort Worth. Again, you can see the route of the patrol that he sends out based on those men being captured. And you all should know how close that is to Washington, D.C. You see the road coming down, the Little River Turnpike coming down into Alexandria. That's a report that he takes, that he puts with that map from the man who led the patrol. So he tells, and I've only put part of it up there. Mentions the town of Acton, the Telegraph Road, Route 1, and Maple Valley. So they come down Little River Turnpike into Alexandria, go down Route 1, all the way to Prince William County. Maple Valley is where Hoadley is today. Anybody know? Is that familiar to anybody now? Big community there now. It's not a little town or anything, but the intersection is still exactly the same as it was during the Civil War. Only there's 1 million homes around it now. And then they come back up Route 1, and they're still scouring. Now, Stuart's gone, but they're still not certain that this is not going to happen. And on that very day, Gideon Welles, Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy, will write that Stuart could have come into the city with impunity. Why? Because at this point, all of the mobile troops, all the mobile cavalry, all Stahl's cavalry has been transferred to the Army of the Potomac. All the mobile infantry has been transferred to the Army of the Potomac. The only troops to defend Washington are the men in the forts. They have no ability to go chase down cavalry. So if a force had come, they are certain that it could have succeeded. So just in conclusion, I think no matter if you have trouble believing that the South ever would have done this, remember, perception versus reality. The Federals believed it, and they believed it because of what he had done in the Christmas tree. By coming through the defenses as he had done, not going around them, he becomes the real fear in their minds. And so when this raid idea is dropped in Heintzelman's hands, they have no choice but to stay with it, and they will believe it to the very end, because by the time it all transpires, that last order, the Battle of Gettysburg has already started. All right, so I appreciate your time. Hopefully I didn't run too long. If there's time for any questions, I'll do my best. And my wife will be happy to, I thank you. My wife will be happy to sell you a couple of books that I have on the one and the newer book now.